In the velvet hush of a private room at a midtown Manhattan steakhouse, a place where fortunes were made and lives unmade over a single glass of whiskey, Ilara, 28, stood like a porcelain doll at an auction of souls. Her father, a bankrupt architect whose dreams had crumbled into dust, had gambled everything away, and his final collateral was her honor. The man he owed, a new money vulgarian named Silas with a predatory gleam in his eye, shoved her forward toward the silent figure at the head of the table. "She's yours, Kane, like we agreed. Untouched," he sneered, his smile a mix of filth and smug satisfaction. "She can work off the rest of the debt now." The air grew thick with the scent of aged leather and expensive cigars, but the man known only as Kane didn't even lift his head, his world contained within the amber liquid swirling in his glass. But what happened in that suffocating silence would change everything, and if you watch until the end, you will understand why a single glance can be more binding than any chain. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from as this story unfolds. Ilara was an architect's assistant, a woman who spent her days sketching lines of impossible grace for buildings that scraped the New York sky. Yet her own life felt confined to the shadows cast by those same structures. She moved through the city with a quiet dignity, her steps measured, her gaze often fixed on the geometric patterns of the pavement, as if mapping an escape route from her own reality. Her resilience was a silent, internal fortress, built from the memory of her mother's kindness, and a moral code that felt increasingly out of place in a world that rewarded brute force. She was a study in contrasts, fragile in her solitude, yet unyielding in her spirit, a person who noticed the smallest injustices and carried them like personal burdens. Her world was a symphony of muted sounds and oppressive textures. The rhythmic clack of her sensible heels on the polished floors of the firm where her ideas were claimed by others. The low hum of the subway, a constant, subterranean vibration that mirrored the anxiety thrumming just beneath her skin. Her small apartment in Queens was a sanctuary of quiet, filled with the scent of old books and brewing tea, but the city's relentless energy seeped through the thin walls. Reflections in darkened windows showed a woman held captive by circumstance, her face a pale oval against the glittering, indifferent skyline. She was trapped, not by bars, by responsibility and a deep-seated fear of what she might become if she ever stopped fighting. Her father's ruin had been a slow, agonizing erosion of the man she once admired. Now his shame was a ghost that haunted their cramped apartment, a heavy presence in every unpaid bill and every averted gaze. This weight was Ilara's inheritance, a debt of honor she felt compelled to carry, even as it crushed her. She endured the condescending smirk of her boss, the predatory calls from collectors, and the profound loneliness of being the sole pillar in a collapsing structure. Her strength was not in defiance, but endurance, a silent promise to herself that she would not break, that she would preserve the one thing they couldn't take, her integrity. She was drowning slowly, with the whole world watching without seeing. The steakhouse was a world away from her own, a gilded cage of mahogany walls, hushed conversations, and the soft clinking of crystal. It was a place built on power, where men like Silas bartered lives with the same casualness they ordered their wine. The air itself felt different here, heavy with unspoken threats and centuries of male dominion. Every waiter moved with a dancer's precision, their faces impassive masks that betrayed nothing. For Ilara, stepping into this room was like crossing a border into enemy territory. The low instrumental music was a mournful score, to her own surrender, each note a reminder of how far she had fallen and how utterly alone she was in a room full of powerful men. As her father finalized his desperate, despicable bargain, a strange stillness settled over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was accompanied with a chilling clarity. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of something terrifyingly unknown. She caught her reflection in the polished surface of the long table, a distorted, elongated figure trapped between the gleam of silverware and the shadows. A flicker of movement at the head of the table drew her eye, a hand perfectly still resting beside a glass. It was a quiet gesture, almost imperceptible, yet it seemed to command the very atmosphere of the room, a silent prelude to the storm she was about to walk into. The final words of this story will invite you to see redemption in the darkest of places. If this journey moves you, please like, share, and comment with your thoughts. Your voice helps these stories find those who need them most. Ilara's days began before the sun, in the gray pre-dawn light that filtered through the single window of her queen's apartment. The hiss of the ancient radiator was her alarm clock, a constant, metallic sigh that seemed to echo the weariness in her own bones. Her routine was a silent ballet of necessity, the careful measuring of coffee grounds, the deliberate buttoning of a plain, high-collared blouse, the practiced way she avoided her own gaze in the cracked bathroom mirror. Every movement was efficient, stripped of joy, designed for survival. On the crowded 7 train, pressed between the anonymous bodies of a city that never slept, she would trace the blueprints of impossible buildings on the fogged glass, her mind escaping into lines and angles, into structures that were strong, beautiful, and free. Her world at Sterling and Associates was a different kind of confinement, one of polished glass and muted ambition. As a junior assistant, she was less a creator and more a ghost, her talent a resource to be mined by her supervisor, Mr. Sterling. He was a man whose compliments felt like violations, whose praise was always a prelude to him stamping his own name on her designs. She wore the firm's unofficial uniform, sensible dark skirts and muted colors, like a suit of armor that had long since rusted through. The relentless ticking of the minimalist wall clock measured not the passage of time, but the slow erosion of her spirit, each tick a grain of sand slipping away from the person she had once hoped to become. The evenings offered no respite, only a return to the suffocating quiet of the apartment she shared with the ghost of her father. He was a man hollowed out by failure, his once brilliant architect's mind now a labyrinth of regret and shame. He would sit in the worn armchair, the television flickering without sound, the glow illuminating the stacks of final notices on the side table. Ilara would move around him, making tea, tidying a space that could never truly be clean of its despair. She never spoke of the crushing weight of his debts, but she felt it in the cold draft from the window, in the taste of cheap bread, in the way he could no longer meet her eyes. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when she allowed herself to remember a different time. A Sunday afternoon in Central Park, her mother's laughter like wind chimes as her father sketched the skyline in a worn leather-bound book. He had taught her that buildings had souls, that a well-placed line could create not just a structure, but a feeling. He had spoken of legacy, of building things that would outlast them all. Now, that same man was a monument to deconstruction, his legacy a pile of rubble from which she was trying to salvage something, anything. These memories were a source of both strength and profound sorrow, a reminder of the beautiful world that had been promised and then stolen away. The city itself had become an adversary. The very skyscrapers she had once admired now seemed to mock her, their glittering facades reflecting a life of power and ease that was impossibly distant. She walked their streets as an outsider, a cog in a machine that functioned on the silent sacrifices of people like her. New York was a symphony of ambition, but she could only hear the discordant notes of survival, the wail of a distant siren, the rumble of the subway beneath her feet, the desperate murmur of 1,000 anxious conversations. It was a city that promised everything to those who could take it and offered nothing but a long, slow fall to those who could not. The pressure intensified with each passing day, becoming a physical presence in her life, a call from a collector, his voice a slick, casual threat that made the hair on her arms stand up. An eviction notice slipped under the door, its stark red letters a declaration of war on their fragile existence. She took on extra freelance work, drafting late into the night until her vision blurred and her fingers ached, fighting a tide that was too strong, too relentless. Sleep became a luxury, and her dreams were haunted by the sensation of falling, of reaching for a handhold that crumbled to dust the moment she touched it. She was holding the world up, and her knees were beginning to buckle. Yet, even in the depths of this struggle, her core of empathy remained intact. One freezing afternoon, she saw a young woman no older than herself, crying on a park bench, her job application papers scattered by the wind. Without a second thought, Ilara sat beside her, helped gather the papers, and bought her a hot coffee from a street vendor, using the last few dollars she had for the week. It was a small, almost insignificant gesture in the grand scale of the city's indifference, but it was an act of rebellion. It was a declaration that, despite everything, she would not let the cruelty of her world extinguish the light inside her. The breaking point arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, calculated act of humiliation at the office. Presenting her latest designs for a luxury high-rise, Mr. Sterling had let her speak for several minutes before cutting her off, patting her shoulder condescendingly. "A valiant effort, Ilara, truly," he'd said to the room of senior partners, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, leaving her standing there, invisible. Her ideas stolen, her dignity stripped away in a room full of silent witnesses. She walked out without a word, the silence of her colleagues more damning than any insult. That night, her father finally confessed the whole truth. The debt wasn't just to banks. It was to a man named Silas, a predator who operated in the city's deep shadows. The amount was staggering, insurmountable. Her father, broken and weeping, told her there was only one way, one final, desperate gamble. He had arranged a meeting with the man Silas answered to, a figure of immense and terrifying power known only as Cain. He explained the terms of the deal he had proposed, his words tumbling out in a torrent of shame. He was not asking for her permission, he was telling her their fate. It was a surrender born of absolute desperation. The ride to Midtown was a descent into a waking nightmare. Ilara sat numbly in the back of the taxi, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and red against the rain-slicked window. She wore a simple black dress her father had laid out for her, a garment that felt more like a shroud. He sat beside her, a shrunken figure in an ill-fitting suit, the air thick with his unspoken apology and her silent terror. She watched her own reflection in the glass, a pale, solemn face superimposed over the indifferent, glittering city. She was no longer a person with dreams of building things. She was now the final brick in the ruin of her father's life, about to be laid in place. At the head of the long mahogany table sat a man who was more shadow than substance, a figure of absolute stillness in the buzzing, sycophantic energy of the room. Cain. The name had been whispered with a mixture of reverence and terror, and now Ilara understood why. He wore a tailored suit the color of a midnight sky, its sharp lines a stark contrast to the moral ambiguity that clung to him like a second skin. He didn't acknowledge her presence, not even as Silas's crude announcement sullied the air. His attention was fixed on the amber liquid in his crystal glass, a miniature world of light and shadow that he commanded with a slow, deliberate swirl of his wrist. The entire room seemed to orbit this quiet, gravitational center. The silence that followed Silas's words was not empty. It was a living, breathing entity that Cain controlled. It pressed down on Ilara, amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart until it was a drum against her ribs. She watched his hand, the long, elegant fingers resting against the cool glass. There was an unnerving grace in his stillness, a predator's patience that was far more terrifying than any overt threat. He made no move, spoke no word, yet his power was an undeniable force that bent the very atmosphere to his will. In that suffocating quiet, Ilara felt like a specimen under grass, her fear a raw, exposed nerve for his silent observation, even though he had yet to look at her. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were not the eyes of a brute or a lecher. They were a startling shade of gray, like a winter storm over the ocean. Cold, deep, and unreadable. There was no flicker of desire, no predatory assessment. Instead, his gaze was analytical, cutting through her terror to see the scaffolding of her spirit, the unbroken lines of her dignity. He saw the fight in her, the quiet refusal to shatter, and in that moment, Ilara felt a different kind of fear. It was the fear of being truly seen by someone who understood the anatomy of a soul, because he had likely spent a lifetime dismantling them. His focus shifted, moving from her to the sweating, grinning figure of Silas. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Cain's expression did not change, yet a palpable contempt radiated from him, a cold fury that was all the more potent for its restraint. He didn't raise his voice. The words were a low, resonant murmur that sliced through the silence with the precision of a scalpel. "You have insulted my table," he said, and the simple statement carried the weight of a death sentence. Silas's smug smile faltered, replaced by a dawning, sickening realization that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The power dynamic of the room had been redrawn with 4 quiet words. Cain's gaze remained locked on Silas, pinning him in place. "You brought me merchandise," he continued, his voice devoid of any emotion, save for a profound, icy disdain. The distinction was everything. For Ilara, the words were a disorienting shock. She had braced herself for the humiliation of being bartered, for her worth to be debated and settled like the price of a commodity. But this man, this architect of fear, was not negotiating. He was rejecting the very foundation of the transaction, dismissing it as beneath him. It was not an act of mercy, but an assertion of a code she could not begin to comprehend, and a sliver of confusion pierced through her terror. With a finality that left no room for appeal, Cain delivered his verdict. "Her debt is mine now. Get out." He made a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture toward the door with his chin. 2 figures detached themselves from the shadows near the wall, men she hadn't even registered as being there, their presence as quiet and lethal as their employer. They flanked Silas, their movements fluid and economical, and escorted him from the room without a sound. The door clicked shut, sealing the world outside. Silas's pathetic attempt at power had been erased as if it had never happened, a testament to the effortless, absolute authority Cain wielded. The ensuing silence was different. The oppressive tension had vanished, replaced by something heavier, more charged. It was just the 3 of them now. Her father, a crumpled effigy of a man, herself, a statue carved from fear, and Cain, who now turned his full attention back to her. His stormy gray eyes held hers, and for a fleeting second, the coldness receded, revealing a flicker of something else, a deep, ancient weariness, the ghost of a wound that had never healed. It was a glimpse into the darkness he inhabited, a moment of unguarded humanity that was more unsettling than his anger. He was not just a monster. He was a man who had made peace with his own damnation. He rose from his chair, his movements imbued with a deliberate, unhurried grace. He was taller than she had realized, his presence filling the space he occupied. He walked not toward her, but around the table, stopping a respectful distance away. "You are not a piece of property," he stated, his voice a low baritone that resonated deep in her chest. It was not a promise or a comfort, but a declaration of fact. The words hung in the air between them, dismantling the reality she had been forced to accept. She had prepared for a battle of wills, for physical violation, but she had no defense against this strange, disarming brand of honor from the most dishonorable of men. He paused, his gaze unwavering, as if waiting for the truth of his words to settle within her. "But from this night forward," he added, the quiet intensity of his voice making the statement an unbreakable vow, "your safety is my problem." The words were a paradox, offering protection while simultaneously sealing her fate. She was no longer her father's collateral or Silas's prize. She was now under the claim of a king in the underworld, her life inexplicably bound to his. He had not freed her. He had simply moved her to a different cage, one with gilded bars and a far more dangerous keeper, whose motives remained shrouded in shadow. Without another word, he turned and left the room, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. His departure left a vacuum, a sudden, ringing emptiness where his immense presence had been. Ilara remained frozen, the echo of his final words imprinted on her mind. Her father finally let out a choked sob, the sound small and pathetic in the cavernous silence. She looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, a throne that still seemed to hold the specter of his power. The scent of his expensive whiskey and something else, something like cold night air and old secrets, lingered. She had been saved from one predator, only to be claimed by another. Life attempted to resume its familiar, oppressive rhythm, but the memory of that night was a ghost that walked beside her. Ilara returned to her drafting table, to the silent commute, to the weary quiet of her apartment, but nothing was the same. The city's ambient noise now seemed to hold a different frequency, a low hum of surveillance she couldn't prove but felt in her bones. She would catch herself scanning the faces in a crowd, searching for a pair of stormy gray eyes in the anonymous sea of humanity. She was no longer just a struggling woman in a vast city. She was a secret, being kept by a man who was himself a secret, and the knowledge was a constant, chilling weight on her soul. This feeling of being observed was no longer a figment of her anxiety. It had become a certainty. She would feel a sudden prickling on her skin, a shift in the atmosphere, and know he was near. One afternoon, seeking refuge in the hushed halls of the Frick collection, she stood before a Vermeer, lost in the painting's serene, sunlit domesticity. When she turned, she saw him standing across the marble rotunda, his dark suit an anomaly among the tourists. He wasn't looking at her, but at the same painting, his expression unreadable. For a long, suspended moment, they were two solitary figures sharing a silent appreciation of beauty, their violent connection momentarily forgotten. Then his eyes met hers, and the truth was over. The encounter shattered her fragile peace. He offered no threat, only a brief, almost imperceptible nod before melting back into the city's flow. But the message was clear and devastating. He knew where she went to find solace. He had breached the last of her defenses, the quiet, internal places where she hid from the world. Her sanctuaries were no longer her own. His presence was an invisible ink staining the pages of her life, revealing himself only when she sought comfort. The fear returned, sharper now, because it was intertwined with a terrifying and unwelcome threat of curiosity about the man who haunted her steps with such disciplined restraint. In his glass-walled office, high above the city, Kane watched the endless river of headlights below, a universe of lives he could touch and extinguish with a single command. The file on his desk was thin, but its contents were dense. Ilara's academic records, her employment history, copies of the brilliant, unsigned architectural sketches Sterling claimed as his own. He studied them not as an investigator, but as a connoisseur of human nature. He saw her resilience, her integrity, the quiet artistry she poured into her work. This fascination was a dangerous indulgence, a crack in the cold facade that had kept him alive for decades. She was a light in his world of shadows, and he knew that light could either expose him or, far worse, be extinguished by the darkness he commanded. Her life, in the meantime, had become a landscape of quiet dread. The incident at the steakhouse had not freed her from oppression, it had merely changed its form. At work, Sterling's condescension had curdled into something more venomous. Having been denied his prize, he now exerted his power in small, cruel ways, dismissing her ideas publicly, assigning her menial tasks, and making comments laced with innuendo that left her feeling soiled and powerless. She endured it with the same silent fortitude she had always shown, but she felt her spirit fraying, the threads of her composure wearing thin under the constant abrasive friction of his malice. One rain-lashed Thursday evening, as she left the office long after everyone else, Sterling cornered her in the empty lobby. His cologne was suffocating, his smile a predatory leer. "Working so late, Ilara. You should be careful. A pretty thing like you alone in the city." He stepped closer, blocking her path to the door, his intention a palpable threat in the sterile, echoing space. She stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs, her voice cold and steady when she told him to move. It was a small act of defiance, but it was hers. Just as his hand reached for her arm, a pair of headlights cut through the downpour, illuminating them in a sudden, harsh glare. A black sedan, sleek and silent as a panther, had pulled up to the curb. The rear window slid down with a faint whir, revealing Kane's silhouette against the city lights. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His gaze, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, fixed on Sterling. And in that single look was a promise of swift, unimaginable consequence. Sterling froze, his bravado evaporating into raw, primal fear. He snatched his hand back as if burned, stumbling away from Ilara with a muttered, pathetic apology. Kane's eyes then shifted to her, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Get in," he said, his voice a low command that was also, impossibly, an offer of sanctuary. The ride was a journey through a different world. Inside the car, the city's chaos was reduced to a silent, strobing light show through the tinted, rain-streaked windows. The scent of aged leather and his subtle, clean fragrance filled the small space, making the air thick with tension. Ilara sat rigidly on the opposite side of the plush seat, hyper-aware of his proximity, of the controlled energy radiating from him. She felt the deep, almost inaudible rumble of the powerful engine beneath them, a vibration that seemed to match the frantic thrumming of her own pulse. They drove through the glistening streets in a silence so profound it felt louder than any conversation could ever be. He broke the stillness without turning his head, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Your employer will no longer be an issue." It was not a promise, but a statement of a future that had already been written. The finality in his tone sent a chill down her spine. How did he know? The question died on her lips, the answer too terrifying to contemplate. He had been watching, always watching. Then he added something that disarmed her completely. "You have a gift for structure, for light." He had seen her work. He had seen her. The validation, coming from this architect of darkness, was a complex, dangerous poison. She found herself caught in a dizzying paradox. The monster who controlled her fate, the man whose world was built on violence and fear, was the only person who had acknowledged the part of her that mattered most. Her boss saw a body to be used. Kane saw the mind of an artist. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Fear, resentment, and a treacherous, deeply unwelcome flicker of gratitude. She refused to give voice to it, to thank him for a protection that was also a form of possession. Her silence was her last remaining piece of autonomy, and she clung to it fiercely as he drove on. He stopped the car a block away from her building, a silent acknowledgement of her need for a boundary, however thin. As she reached for the handle to leave, her fingers brushed against his where his hand rested on the center console. The contact was accidental, fleeting, but it sent a jolt of pure electricity through her. His skin was warm, a shocking contrast to the cold control he projected. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to stop spinning. His gaze met hers, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of surprise, a momentary breach in his fortress of solitude. The air crackled with the unspoken enormity of that tiny, insignificant touch. She fled the car without a word, her skin still burning where they had made contact. She didn't look back, but she felt his eyes on her until she was safely inside her building. That night, she couldn't sleep, the phantom sensation of his touch a brand on her senses. For Kane, the drive back into the heart of his empire was different. He could still feel the ghost of her touch on his hand, a spark of warmth in his cold, ordered existence. It was a sensation he had long forgotten, a reminder of a life and a self he had systematically buried. The feeling was a profound weakness, a vulnerability he could not afford, yet he found himself unwilling to let it go. The next morning, Mr. Sterling's office was empty. His name had been removed from the directory, his belongings packed away in a neat, anonymous box. There was no official explanation, only hushed, fearful whispers that died whenever Ilara walked past. The swift, silent erasure of a man from their lives was a terrifying demonstration of Kane's reach. Her fear was now mixed with a heavy, suffocating guilt. She had not asked for this, but she had benefited from it. His darkness had touched her world and cleansed it for her, and in doing so, it had stained her too. The moral ground beneath her feet had crumbled away, leaving her standing on the edge of his abyss. She tried to erect walls against him, to reclaim the simple, lonely life she had known before. She changed her routines, took different routes home, and stopped visiting the places that had once brought her peace, fearing she would find him there, waiting in the quiet shadows. But his absence was as powerful as his presence. His protection was a silent, invisible cage built around her, its bars forged from his power and her fear. She was safer than she had ever been, and less free. Every moment of peace she experienced felt like a debt she was incurring, one she knew he would one day come to collect. The true nature of her new reality was revealed a week later. A rival of Kane's, a man named Marcus Thorne, who saw Kane's silent guardianship of Ilara as a sign of uncharacteristic weakness, decided to test the boundaries of his power. As Ilara walked home from the subway one evening, a dark sedan began to shadow her movements, its presence far more overt and menacing than Kane's subtle observations had ever been. It was not the car of a silent protector, it was the car of a hunter, and she was its prey. The raw, animalistic fear she had managed to suppress came roaring back to life. She quickened her pace, her keys clutched in her fist, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The car swerved, cutting her off at the entrance to a deserted side street, its engine a low growl. Two large men emerged, their movements economical and predatory. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their purpose was clear in their cold, dead eyes. She was a message to be delivered, a pawn in a war she didn't understand. She was cornered, trapped against a cold brick wall. The familiar city street suddenly transformed into a hostile, alien landscape where there was no one to help her. Just as the first man reached for her, the squeal of tires tore through the night. Another car, Kane's car, appeared as if from nowhere, its headlights pinning the two men in a blinding glare. Kane stepped out, not with the calculated calm she had seen before, but with a contained, lethal fury that seemed to make the very air vibrate. He moved with the fluid grace of a storm gathering force, placing himself directly between Ilara and her assailants. He held no weapon, yet his presence was more threatening than any gun. His eyes, now the color of pure, unadulterated Arctic ice, promised a retribution so complete it would erase them from memory. His protection was no longer a shadow. It was a blade drawn in the open street, and its edge was pointed at the heart of his world. The two thugs hesitated, momentarily stunned by Kane's sudden, formidable appearance. They were hired muscle, accustomed to inspiring fear, not facing it in its purest, most controlled form. Kane stood as a bulwark, a living embodiment of the city's deepest shadows, and his stillness was more menacing than any weapon. For Ilara, the world narrowed to the space between these three men. She was the epicenter of a conflict she could not comprehend, a silent prize in a war of kings. Kane's tailored suit did nothing to soften the lethal intent radiating from him. It was the uniform of a general who had just stepped onto the battlefield, and she was the territory he would not cede. He was not just protecting her, he was claiming his ground. A low, guttural sound, barely a word, escaped Kane's lips. Walk. It was not a suggestion or a threat. It was a statement of the only possible outcome that ended with them still breathing. The air grew thick and cold, heavy with the promise of violence. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, turning the alley into a stage for a grim, inevitable play. The thugs exchanged a nervous glance, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. They had been given an order by their own boss, but the man standing before them was not a man. He was a legend, a ghost who commanded obedience through whispers and rumors. To defy him was to challenge the very structure of their world, a gamble with stakes far higher than they had been paid for. The larger of the two men made a fatal miscalculation, mistaking Kane's silence for an opening. He lunged, a brutish, telegraphed movement born of desperation. The result was not a fight, it was a dissection. Kane moved with an impossible, terrifying grace, a blur of dark fabric and precise, devastating force. Ilara didn't see the blows land so much as she heard their impact, a sickening crack of bone, a choked gasp of pain. The second man, drawing a knife, was disarmed and neutralized in a single, fluid motion that ended with him collapsing against the brick wall, unconscious before he hit the pavement. It was over in less than 5 seconds. A whirlwind of controlled violence had passed, leaving only stillness and the faint, metallic scent of blood in its wake. Kane stood over the two fallen men, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. He hadn't broken a sweat, but a single drop of blood, not his own, marred the perfect white cuff of his shirt. The brutal efficiency of his actions was more chilling than any rage-filled outburst could have been. This was his language, the dialect of his world, spoken with a fluency that was both terrifying and absolute. He had not just defeated them, he had deconstructed them, taking them apart with the detached precision of a master craftsman. He was a force of nature, a storm that had passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving a quiet, unnerving devastation in its wake. The immediate danger was gone, but the air remained charged, thick with the aftermath of violence. Ilara's terror slowly receded, replaced by a profound, disorienting shock. Her gaze was fixed not on the crumpled forms on the ground, but on Kane. He stood with his back partially to her, a solitary figure framed by the dim city lights. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his back. In that moment, he was not the untouchable, powerful figure from the steakhouse or the silent observer in the museum. He was a man who had just shed his armor of control and unleashed the darkness within him, all to shield her from a world he had created. He was vulnerable in a way she had never imagined. It was then that she broke her own code. Her entire life had been a lesson in silent endurance, in making herself small and invisible to survive. But something inside her snapped. She moved. Her feet, seemingly of their own accord, carried her forward, closing the small distance between them. Her world had been defined by fear of him, but in this singular moment, another emotion, fierce and undeniable, broke through. A wave of raw, inexplicable concern. She saw a thin, crimson line on the back of his hand where a lucky graze had cut him, a small flaw in his violent perfection. The sight of his blood, shed for her, was a revelation. Her hand, trembling slightly, lifted. She didn't think, she only acted, driven by an instinct older and more powerful than fear. Her fingers brushed against the sleeve of his dark suit jacket, the fine wool a startling contrast to the cold, hard reality of the alley. It was a tentative, questioning touch, a gesture so foreign to their dynamic that it felt like a transgression against the natural order. She was not recoiling from the monster, she was reaching for the man. The touch was an anchor in the storm, a silent acknowledgement of the terrible price of his protection, a bridge thrown across the abyss that separated their two worlds. Kane flinched, a sharp, involuntary movement, as if her touch were a brand of hot iron. No one touched him. No one dared. He slowly turned his head, and his stormy gray eyes met hers. The cold fury was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded astonishment. He looked down at her small hand on his arm, then back to her face, searching her expression. He had expected to see terror, revulsion, the horror that always followed in the wake of his violence. Instead, he saw a deep, resonant empathy. He saw that she was not looking at him as a killer, but as a man who was wounded. It was a look he had not seen in a lifetime, and it struck him with more force than any physical blow. In that protracted, silent gaze, the truth of their connection was laid bare. She finally understood that his darkness was not aimed at her. It was a shield he held up against the world, and now he had wrapped it around her. And he understood with a terrifying, soul-shaking clarity that this woman, with her quiet dignity and unbroken spirit, had become the one thing he could not lose. He had broken his most sacred rule. He had made it personal. He had stepped out of the shadows and into the line of fire for her, and in doing so, he had exposed the one vulnerability that could destroy him. Their bond was no longer a matter of debt or protection. It was now forged in blood and a shared, dangerous understanding. He gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm, the brief contact ending, but its echo remained. The mask of control slid back into place, but the cracks beneath were visible to them both. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low and rough, stripped of his usual command, and tinged with something new, something raw. He guided her toward the car, his hand hovering near the small of her back but not touching, a gesture of both protection and distance. As the car door closed, sealing them in a cocoon of silence, they both knew that everything had changed. There was no going back. The protector had revealed his heart, and the protected had seen the soul of the man who now owned it. The drive back to Queens was a journey through a void. The violence of the alley had been replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight, pressing them both deep into the plush leather seats of the car. Kane drove with an unnerving stillness, his hands fixed on the wheel, his gaze locked on the rain-slicked ribbon of asphalt ahead. Ilara could feel the chasm that had opened between them, a space once filled with tension and curiosity, now haunted by the ghost of what he had done for her. When he stopped a block from his apartment, he didn't turn to face her. The engine idled, a low, mournful hum. There were no words, only a final, fleeting glance in the rearview mirror, a look that was both a dismissal and a confession of profound, unbearable regret. Once inside the sterile safety of her apartment, the silence followed her, clinging to her clothes like the damp night air. She stood by the window, watching the taillights of his car disappear into the city's bleeding colors, a solitary red star fading into the blackness. The night's events played on a loop in her mind, the raw fear, the sickening crack of bone, the warmth of his skin under her fingertips. She looked at her own hand, the one that had dared to touch him, and saw it not as a part of herself, but as a strange artifact from another life. The profound loneliness she had always known returned, but it was sharper now, defined not by an absence of people, but by the specific, aching absence of him. Miles away, in a penthouse that was more fortress than home, Kane stood before a wall of glass, the sprawling, indifferent city laid out beneath him like a map of his own soul. He methodically cleaned the small, shallow cut on his hand, the antiseptic sting a welcome, grounding pain. He had broken every rule that had kept him alive, that had kept his empire intact. Exposing himself in that alley was a strategic blunder, an emotional indulgence that had sent shockwaves through the foundations of his world. He knew what he had to do. To protect her, truly protect her, he had to sever the connection completely. He had to erase himself from her life, becoming the ghost he had always been, and the decision felt like cutting out a vital organ. The consequences of his transgression were swift and silent, moving through the city's underworld like a change in atmospheric pressure. His rivals, men who had long waited for a crack in his armor, saw the incident not as a show of strength, but as a symptom of a fatal weakness. A woman. The whisper started in hushed back rooms and over secure phone lines. Thorne's humiliation was a public spectacle, but Kane's personal involvement was the real story, a vulnerability to be cataloged and exploited. Kane felt the shift in the delicate balance of power, the predatory eyes now watching him with a new kind of interest. The price of shielding her light was that he had to descend even deeper into his own darkness to defend his throne. For Ilara, the days that followed were a study in emptiness. The subtle, constant feeling of being watched was gone, leaving a void that was more unsettling than his presence had ever been. There were no more chance encounters, no more black sedans waiting in the rain. She was free, but the freedom felt hollow, a desolate expanse of time stretching before her. The rhythmic tick of the clock on her wall, once a sound of oppressive routine, now measured the growing distance between their worlds, each second a shovelful of earth on a bond being buried alive. She was adrift again, but this time she was haunted by the memory of an anchor, and its absence was a constant, pulling ache. The raw fear she had felt toward him began to slowly transmute, tempered by the fire of that night. As she sketched at her drafting table, her mind would drift back to the alley, but the image that held her was not the violence. It was the raw astonishment in his eyes when she had touched him, the flicker of a man drowning in a lifetime of solitude. She began to understand that his brutality was not his nature, but his cage, a prison he had built around himself for survival. Her pain was slowly sharpening into a painful, crystalline lucidity. He was not a monster who enjoyed the darkness. He was a man who had forgotten the existence of light until he saw it in her. A week after the silence began, a thick manila envelope arrived, delivered by a courier who vanished as quickly as he appeared. It contained no letter, no note, only a series of official bank documents. Her father's debts, all of them, had been paid in full. A separate deed showed that the mortgage on their small apartment was now clear. It was a clean, brutal, and impersonal severing of ties. Kane had settled his account. He had purchased her safety, paid for his transgression, and in doing so, had reduced their profound, unspoken connection to a simple financial transaction. The gesture, meant to free her, felt like the heaviest chain of all, binding her to him with the cold, hard weight of an unpayable obligation. She laid the documents on the small kitchen table, their stark black ink a final testament to his power and his distance. This was her chance to escape, to take her father and disappear, to build a new life on the foundation of his blood money. It was the logical, sensible thing to do, but her heart rebelled. To accept it would be to validate the terms of their first meeting, to agree that she was in fact a commodity that could be bought and paid for. It would erase the meaning of his sacrifice, of her own transgressive touch. Her integrity, the one thing she had fought so hard to protect, demanded that she refuse this gilded freedom, even if it meant remaining trapped in the orbit of his memory. Kane enforced his own isolation with a chilling resolve. He became more remote, more ruthless, making a series of cold, strategic moves that reminded the city why his name was spoken in whispers. He was cauterizing the wound she had created, burning away any perception of weakness with calculated acts of dominance. He sat alone in the private room at the steakhouse, the same table, the same chair, the amber whiskey swirling in his glass. But the room was no longer just quiet, it was empty, haunted by the ghost of her defiance and the echo of his own broken code. He had re-established his kingdom's walls, but in doing so, had ensured he was its sole, lonely prisoner. And so they existed in their separate solitudes, two souls on opposite sides of the same city skyline, bound by a shared, defining silence. She would stand at her window in Queens, tracing the distant lights of Manhattan where he reigned, while he stood in his glass tower, his gaze lost in the darkness that swallowed the outer boroughs where she lived. The space between them was no longer just miles of steel and concrete, but an unbridgeable expanse of what-ifs and unspoken truths. The silence was not an absence of sound, but a living presence, a constant, resonant echo of a connection that was too dangerous to exist and too powerful to ever truly die. 2 years passed, a silent, healing expanse of time that Ilara had used not to run, but to build. The money, a weight of blood and shadow, had sat untouched in a bank account until she found its purpose. She used it to fund a public design competition, entering under a pseudonym, and won. Tonight, under the cool glow of a Manhattan moon, she stood before her creation, a community library in a forgotten corner of the city, its facade a symphony of glass and reclaimed steel, designed to let the light in. The building was more than a structure. It was a testament to her survival, a quiet act of defiance against the darkness. The applause from the dedication ceremony washed over her, a sound so different from the suffocating silence of that steakhouse room. Yet she felt a familiar, phantom chill on her skin. She stepped to the podium, not as the trembling, invisible assistant, but as the architect. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clear, resonating with a strength she had forged in fire. "Buildings are not just about shelter," she began, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of city officials and patrons. "They are about creating spaces where people can feel safe enough to dream. They are about light." Her words were a quiet sermon, a philosophy born from a life spent in the shadows. She spoke of hope, of community, of the enduring power of quiet dignity. It was a speech that honored her mother's memory and reclaimed her father's legacy, purifying it of its shame. It was her declaration of independence, written in steel and light against the city skyline. As the applause swelled again, a polite and distant thunder, her eyes were drawn, as if by an invisible string, to the edge of the assembled crowd. There, half hidden by the cool marble of a portico column, stood a figure in a perfectly tailored dark suit. It was Cain. He was not there as a threat, not as a keeper, but as a silent, solitary witness. He stood utterly still, a ghost at the feast, his presence an island of profound quiet in the sea of celebration. He was thinner, perhaps, the lines of his face etched deeper, as if he had carried the weight of both their worlds in the intervening years. He made no move to approach, no gesture to be seen. Yet, in a room full of light, she was all she could see. Their eyes met across the polished stone plaza. The noise of the crowd faded into a dull, distant roar, and for a handful of heartbeats, they were the only two people in the world, locked in a silent, final conversation. In his gaze, she saw none of the cold control or icy fury she remembered. Instead, she saw a vast, desolate landscape of regret, but also a flicker of something she never thought she would see there: pride. It was the look of a man who had protected a single, beautiful thing, and had the strength to let it go. Her own expression was not one of fear or even forgiveness, but of a deep, sorrowful understanding. A quiet, almost imperceptible nod was her only reply, an acknowledgement of the debt, the sacrifice, and the impossible, uncrossable distance between them. He returned the nod, a single, final gesture. Then, as seamlessly as he had appeared, he turned and dissolved back into the shadows of the city from which he had come, leaving her standing in the full, brilliant light of her creation. He had not come for thanks or absolution. He had come to see that his one act of humanity had borne fruit, to witness the light he had shielded now shining on its own. Ilara turned back to the warmth and the voices of her new life, a queen in a kingdom she had built herself. The ache of his memory would always be a part of her, a fine, silver scar on her soul, a reminder that even the deepest darkness can serve the light. His redemption was not in finding love, but in empowering her freedom. Hers was not in forgetting, but in building a future from the ashes of her fear. Their story was a silent testament, written in the spaces between what is right and what is necessary, proving that some bonds are forged not to hold us, but to show us how strong we are when we finally break them. The final words of this story invite you to see redemption in the darkest of places. If this journey moved you, please like, share, and comment with your thoughts. Your voice helps these stories find them who need them most. In the end, a soul is not saved by being pulled from the darkness, but by being given a reason to finally choose the light.